keep in mind, his ships were also in disrepair. He was there because of necessity. If it was up to him, he would have never arrived.
Well, I think maybe his brain is in disrepair.
That's very fair. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Unbelievable, the podcast where I tell my good friend two unbelievable stories from history, one real, one fake.
And I have to guess which one's which.
That's right. I am One is the Loneliest Number, Luis Mejia, joined here by owner of a lonely heart, Kurt Danner. And we're here once again, as we are every week, to share some of the most fun stories from all across time, all across space, but mostly the space confined to this planet Earth and written history.
And a lot of Mexico, specifically.
A lot of Mexico.
Really coincidental.
Very coincidental that most of the stories take place in Mexico. And I'm afraid today won't be any difference, Kurt. But before we get to the two stories that I will share with you today, as we often do, as we do every single week, Kurt, do you have a fun fact for me in order to calibrate my detection skills of right and wrong, of real and fake? Kurt, take it away.
I sure do. So, Luis, tell me, true or false? After a speech given by Brazilian President Emilio Medici in which he criticized the Nixon administration's foreign policy, President Richard Nixon ordered all the tequila in the White House to be thrown away, presumably either believing that tequila came from Brazil or he was indifferent / unaware that Mexico and Brazil are separate countries.
Damn. That sounds like something Nixon would do, so I'm going to say true.
Well, Luis, you have been bamboozled because I made
Damn
that up.
it.
That was a test just to keep you on your toes. I feel like we both get a little lazy with these fast facts sometimes and just whip out some true ones. So, yeah, I just want to keep you guessing. You got to mix it up a little bit, throw you a little curveball. Anyway, that being said, let's get to it.
All right, Kurt. So we're actually going to talk about some really, really fun misadventures all across the world. However, they will once again take place in the span of around the same era of years. So we're going to be focusing for these next two stories in the general 1500s. Okay?
Nice.
This first story, I'm going to be honest with you, involves a little bit of international drama, international intrigue, and a lot of just convoluted dates. So I'm going to try to condense it down as much as possible.
Okay.
All right, to set a little bit of context, we're going to go to Western Europe in the early 1500s. At this point, there are two very big powers in Central Europe, which is the Habsburg dynasty that is ruling from the Holy Roman Empire and Spain. And on the other side, it's the French kingdom.
Also classic.
The French kingdom at this point is owned or run by the Valois family. Okay. So let's just think of it as the Valois versus the Habsburgs. Okay. So France versus Spain and the HRE. All right? Easy enough. Mm-hmm. Now, they're the big players at this point in the world, in the European world. And one of the main things that brings them together, other than immense wealth and power, is that they have a lot of disputed territory within the Italian peninsula. Okay? Now, at the end of the 1400s, France and the Habsburgs decide to duke it out for these territories in the Italian peninsula, which would lead to a series of wars that would go from the late 1400s to the mid 1500s.
Wow. They really had a time of it.
They really did. And these were, I guess, globally or as a group known as the Italian Wars, naturally.
They were like, this is it. This is the one war in Italy that has ever happened, and no more wars will be in Italy. This is the one.
This is the war to end all wars, some would say. We're going to focus, since this takes about 50 to 60 years of warfare, we're actually just going to dive in to a very specific year, and that is 1521.
Okay.
1521, France and the Habsburgs, and particularly France and Spain, are really duking it out. And throughout this conflict, there is a part of northern Spain, or the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula, known as Navarre, or Navarra, if you will. Now, that territory in northern Spain at that point was an independent kingdom, the Kingdom of Navarre. So that was just northern Spain was its own thing. In around 1512,
so they don't have any. Do they have no stake in the war? Then they're just like out there doing their thing, trying to stay out of the line of fire.
Basically.
Wow. Terrible real estate decisions for them, honestly.
It's kind of like being Switzerland in both world wars, Kurt. You're just of surrounded by madness and chaos. Now, here's the interesting thing, unfortunately, Navarre does get involved in this whole global conflict because in 1512, they get invaded by the Castilians, aka the Spanish kingdom, and they take over Navarre in 1512. And they say, you're not a kingdom anymore, you're part of us.
Right. Classic.
As with any other power around the world, Navarre's not really happy, so after about 10 years, they say, okay, we're going to regain our independence. Let's get rid of this. We hate the Spanish because they conquered us, and they're currently in conflict with the French, so we're going to ally with the French to try to regain our independence of the Kingdom of Navarre.
Wow. What a timeless maneuver. What a timeless maneuver. Hey, France, can we be friends because we have a mutual enemy? That one's always in the playbook.
and luckily for Navarre, they're strategically positioned right at the feet of the Pyrenees Mountains, so right on the border with France. Now, that just means that the French troops have easier access to the Kingdom of Navarre. So, in 1521, early in the year in 1521, the Navarran people decide we're going to take up arms and we're going to fight back against the Spanish occupation. And they decide to take over the capital city of Navarre, which is Pamplona. Okay? So they decide to start an armed conflict. They ask the French kingdom to send them troops to help in the siege or the taking of Pamplona, which eventually works. The armed Navarrans come in and take over the Pamplona castle. Then they start getting a bunch of French troops in and everything setting up for a big decisive battle to retake Pamplona from Spanish hands. Now, the Spanish at this point in world history is one of the best equipped militaries in the world. Okay?
True. Credit where credit is due. Spain do be winning a lot.
Yeah, they're best equipped. They have some of the best armor, like plate armor, which is brand new. They have more horses. They have riches beyond compare. They have the best navy in the planet. They also have handguns, so the first use of like muskets in Western Europe.
Question: Are the French or Navarrans susceptible to polio? Is that going to play into it this time?
I think everyone is, Kurt. Well, here's what the French have. The Navarrans do have an advantage over the Spanish. And that is, since they have such close access to the Pyrenees and France, they have so many soldiers. They have like upwards of 50,000 troops taking over the Pamplona castle and its surroundings.
Wow. And
not only that, at this point, France has some of the best cannons in town.
What about the canyons, though? Were they good?
I'm afraid the canyons are not as well known as the cannons, but I'm sure they had pretty good ones.
Probably wasn't going to help in the battle. Eh?
But the canyons, I mean, god damn it, cannons.
Pick a lane, Luis.
I'm sorry, I'm just really excited about this. The cannons that the French have are very special for one particular reason. They're really long and they're pretty small caliber, so they're really accurate. Okay, so they may not have as much explosive power, but they're very direct. This will come into play later, but just get excited about these cannons.
That's cool. I'm also picturing like a comically French-looking soldier with a comically skinny and long cannon barrel.
You know, whenever you picture the French, you picture them smoking long, skinny cigarettes.
Yeah.
Maybe it's an idea that developed from the French cannons of the 1520s. Now, everything's ready and everything's seeming to be on the side of the French and Navarran people. Now, Spain may have had the best army in the world at this point, but they had one critical disadvantage, Kurt. Do you want to take a guess at what it is?
Short cannons and canyons.
That's surprisingly actually one of the main differences, but the year that the Battle of Pamplona takes place in is 1521. Mm-hmm. Do you know what happened that year also?
Are we going to intersect with some crusades? I don't know. Is there another world conflict going on maybe?
In 1521, Mexico Tenochtitlan falls to the hands of Hernán Cortés.
Oh.
So Mexico essentially, or literally becomes now a province of Spain. It
Right.
officially becomes the colony of New Spain.
Right.
Now, that happened earlier in the year. And because of that, young men in Spain that wanted to go off an adventure that would usually seek it out by going to the army, they decided to instead join the Navy in order to travel to the New World, populate it, and control the New World. So while the Spanish army had some of the best technology, war tech around, they had very few people. They were very ill prepared when it comes to people.
Yeah, the resources are spread thin. Because, even more than people, like just adding new territory that you have to govern. That's, resources, time, energy, things like that.
And even enthusiasm for fights in Spain it's not really at an all-time high because everyone's just focused on the New World.
Yeah.
You know?
And then you run into, these type of situations where, your update to extend all your cannons gets put on the back burner so long you can't get the budgetary resources for it. And now the French are rolling in here with their 50-foot needle-shaped cannon.
Right. All over. And going back to cannons, the Spanish cannons are actually very destructive. They're a little shorter and wider caliber, aka they cost a lot more damage.
Right.
The problem is, once again, most of these cannons are reserved for the Navy, for the Spanish Armada, which is one of the reasons the Spanish had the best Navy in the world at this point, because of their cannons. And a lot of the cannons that were not used for the Navy, they were melted down to make more weapons or to make more money.
They accidentally did a little bit too much colonialism and forgot about France.
Yeah, colonialism went a little bad for the Spanish for once. So basically, at this point, the Battle of Pamplona begins to take place. Navarran troops allied with the French fortify the castle of Pamplona and absolutely wreck the Spanish.
Nice.
Really, they go to town against them. It's a massacre for everyone involved. The Castilian soldiers, the Spanish soldiers, are really losing at a very fast rate. They're not having a good time.
They are losing in a big way, as Luis.
In a big way. Yeah, it's not pretty for the Spanish troops. Eventually, this war only lasts until sundown. Or this battle, sorry. The battle for Pamplona lasts until sundown, and all the Spanish troops are kicked out, and Pamplona is won.
Then everybody had to go home at a curfew.
Everybody had to go home. The Franco-Navarran forces turn out victorious, and Pamplona is retaken. Now, everybody did have to go home on either side, but one of the people that went home from the Spanish side was a man that got injured during the Battle of Pamplona. The man that got injured, his name was Íñigo López. Okay? Íñigo López right now may not sound like a very, very important name until you remember where he's from. Íñigo López is from a small town in the Basque region of Spain called Loyola.
I knew it.
Of Loyola was in the Battle of Pamplona, and he was hit by one of these French cannons. Now, the French cannon, being of smaller caliber and very accurate, did not kill him, but rather it really injured his leg. It messed his leg up. Seriously, it broke it beyond any reason.
With deadly accuracy. In the most accurate way possible.
That long cannon was so long, it hit him right in the knee.
He's like in the hospital, and they're like, my goodness, the precision on this wound.
This is terrible news for your legs, but great news for the French. Now, because of this man, Íñigo López, retreats back, does not die, but he goes into recovery in order to cure his leg or heal his leg.
Oh, I'm sure that'll be fun in 1521.
Oh, well, that's
hooked
actually
him up on the anesthetic, I'm guessing, right away.
yeah, directly on the anesthetic.
A little bit of wine if you're lucky, maybe.
If you're lucky. If you're unlucky, your only anesthetic is a swift punch in the jaw until you get knocked out. But because of this, and this is actually quite significant, the recovery time for this leg injury took nearly a year, at the point where Íñigo López was hospitalized. Not hospitalized, he was in his house for a year, bedridden for a year, which gave him a lot of time. And it's 1521. You don't have much else to do if you're bedridden, but I guess
1521 and Lego sets do not exist yet.
He can't spend his time playing FIFA
right
at this point. But Inigo starts reading. One of the only books he has around is the Bible and a book about the lives of the saints.
Wow. No disrespect to the Bible or a book about the lives of the saints, but that was a desperation maneuver to say, I'm going to start reading these two things.
Well, it was such a desperation, and it was such his solitude of only reading these two books that he had the biggest religious conversion around.
Whoa.
He was a soldier, alive, a man of the battlefield. He was known for being a gallant that loved women and alcohol and war. So he had a huge conversion, high off of the non-existent meds he had for his pain, and just reading the Bible and the life of saints, and says, I'm going to be a warrior, a soldier for God.
Wow.
So this is what led to Inigo Lopez's conversion into Catholicism, and to very militant Catholicism. He went to the Temple of Montserrat, to the Virgin of Montserrat, to give symbolically his sword and give up his life of soldiering. And he changed his name to Ignatius. So we are talking of Ignatius of Loyola, famous leader of...
Saint Ignatius.
Saint Ignatius of Loyola, famous leader of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. Eventually, he would go to France, meet up with some buddies in college, make some like-minded individuals who got together and said, hey, how about...
Start a podcast.
They almost basically did start a podcast. They just got together and said, hey, the boys, we should get together and go ask the Pope if we can start a religious sect.
They basically did start a podcast.
They started a very, very popular podcast, which was called the Society of Jesus. So in 1540, they went to the Pope and asked him if they could start their own religious order, which they did. So in 1540, the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits, was born due to a papal bull. Okay, now that's the context of Ignatius starting the Jesuits. But here's where it gets a little freaky, or not a little freaky, it just gets a little wonky.
Okay.
One of the main focuses of the Jesuits is their mission work, so missionary work, and also education and academic resources. Right. So the Jesuits go out to be missionaries and live with the people they're trying to convert. And one of the only ways, or the main way they try to achieve this, is by establishing universities or establishing schools. So education is their main source of, their main way to evangelize is through education. So while the Jesuit order has just started and Ignatius is the general of the Jesuits, which is how they established their order, he says, I'm going to send out a bunch of missionaries, and starts sending all his friends all over the world. He sends them up to Turkey, or Asia Minor as it's called at this point, sends them off to England, even sends them off to Germany, even as far as China and Japan. He always, however, refused, while he was alive, to send missionaries to the New World.
Oh.
Why did he decide not to? Well, he was a little calloused by the defeat he faced at the Battle of Pamplona. Because of the Battle of Pamplona, because they were lacking so many soldiers due to the conquest of the New World, he was resentful of the New World. He was resentful of Mexico in specific.
Wow.
Or what would then become Mexico, and refused to send missionaries into Mexico. Or into Central and South America, and even North America. He said, I will have none of that.
This cannonball really hurt, I guess.
I guess so. He never recovered. He was limping out of sadness his whole life. But he actually did send people to the New World, but not to the Spanish colonies, but rather to the French colonies in what would later become Canada.
Interesting.
With this, Ignatius dies in 1556, and another man named Diego Lainez takes over as the general of the Jesuits. And he says, I'm going to reinforce our missionary work. Let's do what he always wanted, what our good father Ignatius always wanted, and send some Jesuits to Mexico.
Yeah.
And that's what he did. And in Mexico, finally, Jesuits arrived in 1572, about 20 years, almost 20 years after the death of St. Ignatius. And they were so popular in Mexico, Kurt. Like, the Jesuits arrived, funny enough, in my hometown of Veracruz in 1572.
Of course.
and spread through Mexico, spread through South America at such speed and intensity that there are theories that say that if it weren't for the Jesuits, Mexico and South America would not be as Catholic as it is now.
Wow.
Eventually, there were some issues with the Jesuits in Mexican history. They were kicked down and then brought back in. But if you look at the spread of the Jesuit influence in the Americas, you can see a bunch of academic institutions. One of the biggest universities in Mexico, the Ibero-American University, is a Jesuit university here in Mexico. The patron saint of the city of Querétaro is Ignatius of Loyola. A bunch of different universities, Jesuit universities in South America. A bunch of Jesuit universities were established in the United States, including our alma mater, Loyola University of Chicago.
Go Blurs.
Go Blurs. But all of this was essentially against the wishes of Ignatius of Loyola, who always held a grudge against New Spain and the Spanish colonies because he got hit in the leg by a long, skinny French cannon back in 1521.
Cannon.
Damn it! So, yeah, Ignatius of Loyola had a disdain for the New World, and it was a disdain that, unfortunately, God ran through, and no one really cared after his death.
Wow.
But all because the soldiers were missing back in the Battle of Pamplona.
Wow. I love all the chain reactions of things in this story. It's really funny to me of him, reading the history of saints in the Bible. It's kind of like he went to the bathroom without his phone, except it was for a year. And that hit him so hard that he fully created a new religious sect.
He only had the shampoo bottle to read while he was bedridden.
And it had immeasurable effects on his mind.
Basically, yeah, if it weren't for that.
Yeah. But, also, what if the French cannon had missed? Had it not been so long and skinny, could have missed his leg. And then
could have killed him.
I was gonna say then he would have not been mad at New Spain, but also then I guess maybe there would have been no Jesuits. I don't know.
Maybe.
So
maybe.
It's just, I guess it's all this to say that it's a very interesting story, that there's so many kind of little coincidences in here that add up to literally an entire religion that, colonizes the world in a sense.
And all because Mexico was conquered. So it's first of all, Mexico cameo. Veracruz cameo.
Even Veracruz cameo, yeah.
And Habsburg cameo in this whole story.
Classic. No Maximilian, but it was like unspoken. He's near, I sense.
The Habsburg king, the Holy Roman Emperor at this point, was Maximilian I. Different Maximilian. But it was a Maximilian and a Habsburg.
See, he's just off screen. I knew he was right there, looming over us. Always watching over us is
Always
Maximilian.
All right, Kurt, for this next story, it has a lot of similarities to the first one, and I will lay them out. It has everything we've come to love from the first story. The 1500s.
Oh, yes.
Grudges against New Spain.
Oh, yes.
Veracruz cameo.
Oh, yes.
And cannons.
What's the situation on the canyons?
All right, so who loves cannons, Kurt? Take a quick guess. Is there anyone in particular around world history that or a specific group that just loves cannons?
Excuse me. Number one, everyone loves cannons. If you don't, get out of this podcast. This isn't a safe space for you. We've got cannons over here. But secondly, oh, wow, really a toss-up. Because first I'm thinking maybe one of the Chinese dynasties. But I literally am at the point where I don't know if I'm thinking that they had cannons for fireworks because that's true, or because you told me that in a previous made-up story.
No, Kurt, you need to simplify your logic a little bit. There's a specific group of people in history around 1600s that loves cannons, and that's pirates. Pirates love cannons.
Yeah,
okay?
I overthought.
You overthought. You
forgot
went
this was a Luis episode for a second. My bad, dude.
It's a Luis episode where I'm all about just fun. It's just fun.
Yeah,
Get rid of intellectual.
When I ask a question, don't think. Just answer pirates and hope it's the right one. Because it will be.
The stories that I try to tell you, Kurt, mostly run on vibes. Don't try to understand them. Just have fun with them. Ride the wave, okay? Now, we're actually going back to the 1500s, a little bit farther ahead in our story. So this is after our main man Ignatius died in 1556. So in the 1560s, there was a man, an Englishman, by the name of John Hawkins, okay? Very good name. He was a pirate. to start off, which, by the way, John Hawkins, incredible name for a pirate.
I feel like that's a good, like, his real name was John Hawkins, but I need him to have, like, some other completely unrelated pirate nickname, like
Patrick?
No, like Red Ears the Barbarian or something. I don't know. But then it's like, did you know his real name was actually John Hawkins and he was a school teacher before this? And you're like, wow, Red Ears the Barbarian. Oh, I never knew that. All right, will you settle for Johnny Hockey? Can we agree on Johnny Hockey?
Let's do Johnny Hockey. Johnny Hockey. So John Hawkins, or Johnny Hockey, began his life as a privateer in the English Navy, which is essentially legalized piracy, or piracy sponsored by the English crown.
Okay, contractually obligated privateering is state-sponsored piracy. Disclaimer, thank you, Luis. Not that I disagree, it's just funny to hear you say it every time. Takes a Pirates 101 class in college one time.
It's being a pirate, but all of your income and all of your looting is itemized by the IRS.
Yes.
Essentially.
Yes, very true.
Anyway, he was a sailor, a privateer, and decided to get involved in the world stage at this point. He saw that empires like the Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire were making a lot of money for their respective world powers, and he said, how can I do this for England? He not only saw at the greediest empires in the world, but he saw that their biggest source of wealth at this point was the triangle trade, which, do you know what the triangle trade is?
Need those triangles. They're desperate to get them.
No, Kurt, triangle trade is also known as the slave trade between the transatlantic slave trade.
I had like 3 more riffs, and I'm so glad I hesitated.
So
stop the podcast anyway. You know what? Just in case, stop it.
Stop it now to avoid further cancellation.
Yeah. And please, go on, Luis. Continue.
But John Hawkins notices that there's a lot of money to be made in the transatlantic slave trade. And he notices that England does not have a foothold in this market. And he says, I'm going to take advantage of it.
John,
Economics
good instincts,
101. Good business instincts, terrible morality. So he decides to start taking trips to Africa with a bunch of his men and round up African slaves to sell them in the New World. So in 1562...
Actually, can I ask, does he buy people who are already enslaved, or is he like going and catching people? Not that it matters, but I'm just interested.
He's doing what the Portuguese and the Spanish had been doing for years now, which is getting in talks with leaders of enemy tribes of Africa, in Western Africa, getting in cahoots with them and fighting other tribes in order to get them into slavery. So yes, they were technically buying slaves from other Western African tribes in order to sell them across the ocean.
But they're kind of contracting them to go out and get them to, so it's maybe a little...
Right. The only reason that business existed in Western Africa, the only reason why slave traders in Western Africa existed is because Spanish and Portuguese sailors decided it was going to be a business.
They were like, don't mind us over here just creating massive demand.
Basically. It's terrible stuff. But in 1562, he goes to Western Africa to gather slaves with a bunch of his men and rounds them up and goes across the Atlantic to sell them in the islands, in the Caribbean islands, the Antilles and Cuba and Jamaica and all these little places. He starts doing this for several years, starts doing a bunch of different journeys back and forth, going to Africa, securing slaves, coming back. He does this without fault or anything for around 6 years.
Okay.
But in the fateful year of 1568, as he's heading to the Caribbean islands, he gets caught up in really terrible hurricanes and really terrible tropical storms, which leads Johnny Hockey and his men to crash land is not the word, because they're ships, to get shipwrecked, essentially, in the coast of Veracruz, my hometown.
Classic.
So Veracruz is a coastal town in the Gulf of Mexico. And so John Hawkins and his 13 ships get shipwrecked in the island known as San Juan de Ulua. It's an island where they built a fortification, still there to this day, but it's essentially a castle on an island that was used as a harbor, as a natural harbor for most of the history of Veracruz. Now, John Hawkins arrives here with his 13 men and says, okay, we're in a bad position. We're essentially economic enemies with the Spanish, and we've just arrived in the main Spanish port in mainland America. So I need some help. So he arrives in San Juan de Lua.
Called AAA.
Essentially calls AAA, but by calling AAA, he calls on the Spanish government, the viceroyalty that is there at that point. He gets lucky that a couple days after he shipwrecks in San Juan de Lua, the new viceroy of New Spain was arriving in Veracruz at that point. So he is able to flag him down and say, hey, I've got 13 ships here with me with around 300 men. I've sold all my slaves. I just want safe passage, man. Like, please let me fix my ships. Let me buy some supplies and trade freely. Like, I'm not trying to get into any issues with you guys. I just want to be able to fix my ships and get out of here. The viceroy and the viceroyalty and the authorities of New Spain say, sure, man, you're cool. You can stay here. It's not a problem.
They're like his moxie.
Yeah, they think, okay, he behaved like a gentleman. He's a gentleman pirate, if you will. And he decides to stay there for a while.
Gentleman pirate slaver.
Yeah, well, at that point, really, who wasn't a slaver that was also Western European, Kurt? Like, at this point, everyone's terrible. Now, a couple days go by, and this peace between the Spanish and the English is not going well at all. They keep hurling insults at one another.
Who could have predicted?
They keep hurling insults at one another, and it's not a good peace. It also gets exacerbated by the fact that John Hawkins takes over the fortress at San Juan de Lua and takes a couple hostages.
That wasn't in the mix.
Well, he does this to keep safe himself.
I don't know where the sign off for that was.
Well, he took it over without any bloodshed, and he tells the Spanish, okay, I will return these guys with no issue if you assure me safe passage.
Little safety deposit action.
Essentially. But that rose the tensions between the two sides. Right. One night, Hawkins and his crew notice that the Spanish ships that are anchored in San Juan de Lua are passing artillery and passing men and arms over from ship to ship as if preparing for an attack.
Oops.
And John Hawkins goes up to the authority and says, hey, man, what the hell? I thought you said we could stay here until we left. And the Spanish authority said, oh, yeah, you're right. Sorry, misunderstanding. Oops. Nothing will happen. Don't worry. You have our word. And at this point, that really gets John Hawkins really angry because at this point, the opposing forces in the harbor kind of hate each other for very specific reasons. So they both hate each other mostly because they're economic enemies and because they are, well, diplomatic enemies at this point also. The English see the Spanish as heretics because they're all Lutheran now too. They see them as slavers. They see them as pirates, which is funny because the Spanish were all of this also. They were also slavers and pirates, but whatever. The English see the Spanish as greedy. They see them as people that are totally devoted to the Pope and traitors to whatever. They hate each other.
Right.
Anyway.
Fill in the blanks.
Yeah, it's bad news for everyone involved. So about a day after Spain gives John Hawkins her word that they're going to be fine, that they're not going to be attacked.
The reassurance.
They're attacked.
Who could have foreseen?
Yeah, so after Spain says, I would die before I attack you, they attack him.
Spain's like, look, we're all trying to find this guy who's trying to attack your boats, okay?
Someone here just attacked you guys. We're all trying to find the enemy. So Spain surprises John Hawkins with a sudden attack at night. Hawkins was not expecting it, and it's a massacre.
How was he not expecting it? What kind of idiot? I mean, I guess I'm not necessarily rooting for John Hawkins here, but what's he doing out here? Well, this seems like bad management tactics.
Keep in mind, his ships were also in disrepair. He was there because of necessity. If it was up to him, he would have never arrived.
Well, I think maybe his brain is in disrepair.
That's very fair, Kurt. I have nothing to say against you. That's true.
How hard is it to have someone keep watch or just have people prepared to be attacked? I don't know,
Kurt. I wasn't there. All right. Also, let's think about this. It's 68? It's 1568. It's hot. You know, people.
You got me there.
Listen, Kurt, this historical event happened about 20 minutes from where I live. And I can tell you, whenever it's hot, you don't want to do anything.
Oh, true. So, okay, wait. You are winning me over now. No AC.
Yeah. Whenever it's hot, Kurt, you've lived with me. You understand whenever the heat gets above 85, I will not do anything.
I mean, I have experienced the humidity of the Caribbean to the extent where I would literally rather die than continue experiencing it. So maybe they were just like on the boat and they saw them coming and they're like, you know what? So what?
So what? Yeah,
So be
essentially.
it. So be it.
Well, anyway, the massacre begins. It's terrible for everyone involved, but mostly for the English.
Right.
Hawkins and his men are able to
They're on
sink
the
up.
business end of the massacre.
They really are. And they're talking
About time.
great business. Yeah, really. Hawkins and his men do end up to sink about 2 or 3 Spanish ships, but the Spanish sink way more of his ships. So he had 13 ships in total, Hawkins, that he had parked here or he had anchored in San Juan de Lua. He left with 3. Essentially.
Okay.
So they destroyed 10 ships. Hawkins and his other sub-generals were able to escape, very badly wounded, but they traveled down the coast of Mexico. They got the hell out of Dodge.
Yeah.
Very angry at the Spanish because they were essentially traitors once again.
Right.
They begin their return to the islands to try to get back to England. On the way, there's a bunch of his men that say, we're going to mutiny if you don't let us off of the ship. We're starving. It's better to die on land than to die on the ship. So they say, okay. About half of his men that were on the ship with him leave in the coast of Mexico, and they get sold. They get either killed by some of the natives or they get sold into slavery by the Spanish. So really not good. And the ones that were sold into slavery by the Spanish were indeed tried by the Spanish Inquisition for not being Catholic.
Oh, wow. Insult to injury there.
Really insult to injury to those people that thought they were going to survive once they were in
They
land.
said, not only are you a slave, you're a slave who wasn't Catholic before this. Boom time.
Do you really think the Spanish Inquisition went against their slaver tendencies? No, they only went against them because they were Lutheran, not because of anything else, Kurt. And you know what? I read an article once a long time ago, and I'm paraphrasing it, that said the Spanish Inquisition would probably try Jesus as a heretic because Jesus would not claim his sole devotion to the Pope. So the Spanish Inquisition would really call anyone a heretic. Anyone that was not saying the Hail Mary and Our Father in Latin would be killed.
Real buzzword, They're really throwing that one around.
Seriously are. Now, John Hawkins and the last remaining of his men eventually do get back to England. And this is where that Mexico tale kind of ends. He goes back to England, John Hawkins does, and he doesn't really do much. He essentially retires. He realizes this was very bad news for him and his men. So he's just going to leave and try to retire to a simple, kind of calmer life. Mm-hmm. A person that decides not to do that is one of his sub-generals. Remember when I told you that one of the people that escaped with him was his other leadership? Yeah. One of the people that escaped with him, his name is probably someone familiar to you. It's Francis Drake, also known as Sir Francis Drake.
Yeah.
Now, Sir Francis Drake, he's very well known to be a sailor, also a privateer, and one of the most important sailors for England at that time, from the second half of the 1500s. One of the main reasons he's remembered for is that he destroyed the Spanish Armada. Now, what is the Spanish Armada? We mentioned them a little bit briefly in the previous story. At this point in history, Spain had the best navy in the world. Absolutely. They were so good, they were known as the indestructible Armada.
Wow.
They had great cannons to start off.
Classic.
And
canyons, 6 out of 10.
We'll see. But it was an indestructible naval force that for years they had just a total hegemony over the seas and over a lot of Europe. Mm-hmm. Now, Francis Drake, having been in this battle for San Juan de Lua, he for the next 20 years says, I am going to kill every Spanish person I find.
Yes, we love a vendetta.
I am going to go on just a warpath to make sure Spain never does this again. And he does. So this happened in 1568, okay?
Okay.
For the next 20 years, Francis Drake amasses a group of men, amasses a couple of ships, becomes a privateer for Queen Elizabeth I, and starts going to Caribbean waters, destroying every single Spanish ship he can find, taking prisoners, taking loot, as well as amassing a greater naval army. Eventually, in 1588, Kurt, 20 years after his defeat in San Juan de Lua, Sir Francis Drake destroys the Spanish Armada.
Wow.
Giving a decisive blow to the indestructible navy of the Spanish. And because of this, the tides or the balance of power in Europe began to drastically change.
Yeah.
So up until this point, Spain was the number one power in Europe and arguably the rest of the world.
Right.
Because of this decisive defeat, England and the English Empire began their quick rise to power. For the 300 years that would follow the 1588 attack when the Spanish Armada was destroyed, we would get all of the different English colonies around the world. We would get, including the United States, and we would get this hegemony of England and this superiority, this power of England that lasted up until the end of the Second World War. And all because Sir Francis Drake and John Hawkins were surprised by New Spain officers in San Juan de Lua off the shores of Veracruz.
That the Viceroy was such a bad host that Sir Francis Drake took on his own personal, like, John Wick vendetta campaign on the Spanish. I mean, genuinely, I feel like that would be a movie I'd watch. Him working his way up all the way to destroying the Spanish Armada. Wow.
Yeah. Why do you think the Spanish are now known as great hosts? They think they learned from their mistake.
Yeah, they were like, okay, we cannot afford another one of those economically.
Guys, we used to be in the top of the world. Come on.
Man, that was a rough few years for Spain. They got the business from France there because they had all the resources in the colonies, and then they accidentally stepped in it with Sir Francis Drake. Yeah.
You know, if we find a bit of a pattern with the Spanish Empire from all the stories we've told in this podcast, Spain somehow always sticks their foot in their mouth. Like, they tie their own shoelaces together and are surprised when they trip.
Yeah.
Seriously. So who knows, man? Maybe it's for the best. But then again, the Spanish Armada being destroyed means that England would become the power in the world. And also, John Hawkins and his proliferation of the Atlantic slave trade made it so that England became the number one trader of slaves in the world because John Hawkins opened the door for this.
Yeah.
So essentially, colonialism bad. Once again, I think that's not controversial to say, but you know.
Yeah, no, I mean, as far as our net goodness here, you know, we kind of have evened out all in all. But I like that, you know, sometimes in history, like you were saying, Spain ties their shoelaces together and then is surprised when they trip. Sometimes Spain even sails across the world just to find a rake to step on, it seems like. And in this case, they just had like a rake, you know, drift into their harbor, and they're like, ooh, this could be fun.
They see something shiny and say, I can step on it. Don't worry. This time I step on this rake, it won't hit me.
Oh, man. I love that. I got to say, I was really not expecting the story to take that turn at the end. I was just all in on where, like, the politics and society of the Caribbean and privateers and pirates. And then all of a sudden we had, like, an off-screen vendetta campaign that was like, this was the end of Spain a little bit.
Maybe, a little bit. And throughout this whole thing, the one through line between all of these two stories, Kurt, is those damn cannons.
It's always
around.
It's always
the cannons. All right, Kurt. Well, those are the two stories I had for you. Let me remind you what you just heard. The one that I just told you is the tale of the Spanish Armada being destroyed at the hands of Sir Francis Drake due to poor hospitality given to him in the beautiful port city of Veracruz. And the first story you heard was Ignatius of Loyola, Saint Ignatius of Loyola, getting his leg absolutely destroyed by a long, skinny French cannon and finding it in his heart to never set foot in New Spain again.
Neither one. Not the good one or the bad
one. No Jesuit will ever set foot in the Americas, is what Ignatius thought, because of the conquering of Mexico City. What do you think, Kurt? Let's talk about it.
Oh, I love both of these stories. I feel like really caught me off guard kind of right in the middle because, you know, I kind of said, like, I knew it when you said it was Ignatius in the first story. I was kind of suspicious of it, but it wasn't right up until like a few sentences before I was like, wait a minute, This seems like I might know this man. And like I said, the same thing with our surprise John Wick plot right in the middle of our piracy privateer story. It's really fun also that both of them kind of take place in the same time period, but in very different places in the world because, neither one of these stories, I think, are very well known, even though they both are really interesting and really almost kind of hard to believe in some places. And it's not just that they've been forgotten with time, but even in the time period they took place, it was just, there were so many things going on in the world that people didn't know about this thing going on over here because they have this crazy thing going on right in front of them,
And it's fun to put things into perspective, all of these different world events happening at the same time. Like right when the Habsburgs and the Valois were fighting, Mexico City was being conquered at the same time that Sir Francis Drake was destroying the Armada. It really, so much going on in the span of 100 years.
Yeah.
Which is why I think the 1500s is a very fascinating
Spain was real busy.
And that's just...
They had a lot going on.
Yeah, they had a lot going on, and they had a really hard time managing it all.
Okay, I have something I gotta say. So, as I mentioned earlier about, I can't tell if the Chinese dynasties were really invested in cannons or not, or that's just something that you made up to me. I can already feel both of these stories deeply seeping into me. So, I think I've got to start making some moves here. We've at least got to start this process, which is our least favorite part of this podcast.
Deliberation.
Okay, all right. Let me just talk you through my process here. So first I want to say, as I think you remember, Luis, I actually did not start my college experience at Loyola. I transferred to Loyola. And so as part of transferring, I had to take this class where I learned a whole bunch about Loyola and their mission statement. So that's kind of why I recognized St. Ignatius coming. So I knew about this story with his getting hit in the leg by a cannonball and then being in bed, and that was what led to this religious conversion. But I suspect that you know that I would have known that. And here's what I'm getting hung up on, is I've never heard this detail of him having this vendetta against the Americas or New Spain. And I've been the whole episode going back and forth in my head about, did you not know that I would know quite a bit about St. Ignatius, or did you know that? And you added a fake detail at the end to throw me off.
Well, that's up to you to decide.
So, yes, I understand that. Now, the second story. So I had this whole St. Ignatius thing on my head, on my mind for the second story. And so I was really weighing one against the other and trying to see, does it look like this is a made-up story? If I were Luis, what kind of privateer story would I make up? And here's what I ended up with. When the Sir Francis Drake thing came in and we got the John Wick plot, I just fell in love with the story too much, okay? I don't want to say that I love this character, because, again, he was formerly a slaver, but I do really like the idea of just, like, this little stupid mishap of, foreign policy, whatever, blah, 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 in the Caribbean ends up in, like, this whole revenge plot that topples the Spanish Armada. So I'm just going with, I think that you are trying to maybe fake me out with this St. Ignatius story. Go Blurs.
Go Blurs.
And hopefully the Sir Francis Drake John Wick revenge plot is true. That's my final answer.
Oh, man, Kurt, you really are set on this decision, aren't you? How interesting. Well, you're correct, Kurt. Good job.
Oh!
Good work.
Wow.
You're very correct. It is true. It is true. Sir Francis Drake did go on a John Wick revenge story, and it's because of a battle that happened about 15, 20 minutes away from where I am right now that the tide of the power struggle between European powers fully changed for the rest of history.
Wow.
Sir John Hawkins did start the slave trade for the English. Not good.
Thanks, John.
The Spanish were once again cowards and traitors.
Oops.
And
bad hosts.
Bad hosts. Really bad hosts.
Wow.
But yeah, it is true, which I find really interesting because this story seems, again, right up my alley. Like, it seems like something I would make up. Because
yeah, it really does.
It's such a vibes story, It's such a ride with it, feel it. Mm-hmm. What are things that I would like to hear? It's right there. And I think it just goes to show that history really is that fun.
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah, I was thinking as well that it seemed like a story that you would desire to make up, because I think kind of where I was landing is I feel like, I guess I'm really curious in a second how much you knew that I knew about St. Ignatius, but I wasn't really super confident that that was the case. It was more just like, if you had made up the Sir Francis Drake story, I was okay with losing to that one, because I was like, this is a banger Louis story. And I also kind of hope it's true, but wow, that is fantastic to find out that actually happened. little bad hosting led to the toppling of the Spanish fleet.
And I actually read this in a book that I own called A Chronicle of the Port of Veracruz. Really highly recommended.
Wow, that's a desperation move.
It is a desperation move. I went to the Veracruz book.
Did you get hit in the leg by a cannonball?
Yeah, seriously. Now, I read this book, and I really loved how they described the battle that ensued in San Juan de Ulua between Hawkins and the Spanish. It says, the spectacular naval combats that Hollywood uses day to day to appease their clientele that loves violence could give us a slight idea of what this battle would have looked like. So just imagine the most intense Hollywood battle between ships, like a master and commander situation, but more than that. And that's what this battle supposedly looked like.
Wow. High praise.
And I love that. I really love that. So I'm really happy that it's true. And it goes to show just how piracy influenced a lot of world history. And we often just think of pirates as just these little fun, romping cowboys in the ocean, Now, Kurt, when it comes to the Loyola story, I did know that you were going to know a lot about Loyola.
Okay.
That is something that I was familiar with, considering that we did go to the same university, and I understand that we kind of are indoctrinated to know the whole St. Ignatius story. So I did know that from the get-go. So I wanted to find a way to flip this on its head. So for some reason, I went in searching about the Battle of Pamplona the other night, and I realized, okay, it's pretty interesting. When did it happen? 1521. What happened 1521? The fall of Mexico. So I really wanted to involve that and make that a big reason why the Spanish lost and everything.
Yeah.
And a big reason why Ignatius never wanted to come to the Americas. Now, the only part of that story that is true, Kurt, is Ignatius's brief story of religious conversion and getting shot in the leg. Right. Other than that, everything is made up. The Battle of Pamplona did happen, but it was a victory for the Spanish side.
Oh, okay.
And the French were not known for their cannons. Kurt.
Oh no, the long skinny cannons don't exist. Oh, I'm so
sad
now.
No one had special cannons. Seriously, the only difference that having France in that war was that they had just had more people. That's it. Loyola didn't care for New Spain, didn't have any strong feelings for or against it. The reason that Spanish had fewer forces was not because they were in New Spain. It's just they just had less people around.
Just miscounted.
Yeah, just miscounted. They didn't think that the Navarre to Pamplona takeover would be that intense.
Didn't budget enough.
No, they really didn't. Yeah, at this point, again, Spain was the strongest empire in the world. It didn't matter if they were out conquering New Spain. Plus, we have to remember, Mexico was only taken over by around 800 men, Spanish men.
Right.
The rest were natives. And then eventually, it would grow to be the force that we know it now to be. But it wouldn't have made a difference for inter-Spanish conflict at all. It really wouldn't be.
Wow. Well, I said I was hoping I would not have to give up on the John Wick revenge plot, but I never considered I would have to give up on the long, skinny French cannons. That's really a casualty I wasn't anticipating from this episode. That sucks.
The French cannons really are the big one. I was very excited about I did write in my notes a little table, and I'll post it. We'll post it maybe later on Instagram. It's just a little table that has French on one side and Spanish on the other side, and the title of it is Cannons. On the French side, it says longer barrel, more accurate. On the Spanish side, it says more destructive, more mobile.
Wow.
That's all I have. And I don't know why I got inspired to make up the cannon story.
Those are the only two genders I recognize: longer barrel, more accurate; more mobile, more destructive.
But you know what? It's interesting because I find it that somehow I did write the Loyola story first before I found about the other story, and I found it very interesting that they did have a lot of similarities within them. All about grudges and somehow about cannons. It got involved. I don't know how cannons got in there. It's always the cannons. They always came in there. But you know what? This is one of the first times we'll notice that the French and the English were all involved in these stories. However, they never fought each other. One of the first times in history when the French and the English were not in with bad blood. It was all against the Spanish. So there we go.
Wow. Little bonus award for French and English. One full episode. No conflict with each other. Well, I will say, lastly, Luis, one thing I was also interested about. So do you know that the recovery process of St. Ignatius, when he broke his leg, it took a long time because in order to keep it the same length as the other one, they had to keep like re-breaking it and then extending it. So he was in bed because they were like re-breaking and then letting it heal and then breaking it again like over and over.
That's what. And he actually also kept his military boots, which were really, really tall boots, for the rest of his life. He always wore military boots because they would keep his leg in place.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
If he takes the boot off, it just all falls apart like a tower of Jenga blocks.
For the love of God, do not take this boot off.
It's all going to unravel.
Oh, God.
It's just the boot and some duct tape holding this man together.
Seriously. And I'm faith in God, I guess.
You know what? As someone who went to a Loyola school, I think that's the kind of legacy that St. Ignatius would want. Only held together in the end by his military boots, some duct tape, and faith in God.
What else could you need?
Yeah.
Well, Kurt, with that, I believe we're coming to the end of the episode. What does that put us up to in the tally, considering that you were able to get that story correctly?
That brings it now to 5 for me and 3 for you. So you better watch out, Luis.
Goodness.
I've been where you were before, and you got to get a hold of this quick. Otherwise, you lose your mojo. You're up at night. You can't sleep. Where did it all go wrong? The hair is falling out. You know.
If we've learned anything from these stories, is that people that are on the losing side are able to hold grudges until they turn out victorious at the end.
That's
I
true.
think that might be me.
We love a good revenge plot on this podcast, baby.
Well, anyway, with that, we're going to call it an episode for today. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Unbelievable. Did you get this story correctly? Were you just as clever as Kurt to look through my lies and look through my just vibe with it stories? Or did you fall for my sultry voice about religious conversion? We'll see. Let us know. We are on social media, on Instagram at UnbelievablePod. We're also on Twitter at UnbelievablePC. And you can check us out on YouTube. That's also a place where our podcast is. Just look up Unbelievable Podcast. We should be there. And if you like the show, maybe give us a review. If you don't like the show, give us a review anyway. Really yell at us as much as you can with your anonymous digital voice. We can take it, maybe.
Maybe. We'll see.
And with that, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening.
And remember, everyone, don't be a bad host if you value your Navy. If you have a Navy, I don't know. Maybe be a bad host. I'm not sure what they got on it.
See ya.
Bye, everyone.